Expanding Mind with Erik Davis, Thursdays at 2 p.m. on the Progressive Radio Network.
Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, and we will voyage forth into our continuing investigation of the cultures of consciousness. Thanks for listening. I wanted to mention that Expanding Mind now has a nice podcast feed on the Progressive Radio Network website, as well as access to all its archive there. So please check that out. And thanks again for listening. Our numbers are pretty good, and it makes me happy that people like what we're doing here as we explore the varied dimensions of the human mind and spirit. And today we're going to go in a slightly peculiar direction, towards the dark, the fascinating, the twisted, the pathological fascinations within us all. I mean, we all know about rubbernecking. We all do it, or at least understand why it's being done. And it's actually kind of remarkable when you think about a highway full of hundreds and hundreds of cars hurtling towards important destinations will suddenly become a flow of molasses when there's some car accident. These sort of modern sacred eruptions in the midst of our mundane experience, sit on the side of the road, and we kind of wonder whether are we going to really look? No, maybe I shouldn't, but I'm kind of fascinated. And one time I came across a car wreck on the Bay Bridge, and it had just happened. There was no emergency vehicles there, and I mean, it probably had happened 45 seconds before I drove by, just enough time to slow down. And it was like a theatrical scene. It was so over the top that I couldn't believe that it was real, and yet it was absolutely and utterly fascinating. And there were people there who were already helping out, so there was no point in me stopping. So I didn't engage it as like something where I would go and help, and there was already, I could see the flashing lights in the background, so there wasn't really much to do except just witness this moment before the police and the ambulance showed up and kind of tried to sort of organize the chaos. And it was just the chaos, and it was this it was like a sort of sacred eruption of visceral, unorganized reality into this sort of mundane drive home. And we all have these fascinations, and some of us indulge them, some of us deny them, some of us just kind of, dip in now and again. Last night I was looking at a great DVD called Experiments in Terror 3. There's two earlier ones. And it's basically experimental filmmakers playing with the horror genre. And great stuff on it, a bunch of short films. But the one that really grabbed me was this short movie by Carrie Burt called The Psychotic Odyssey of Richard Chase. And Richard Chase was a guy who lived in Sacramento in the mid-to-late 70s, and he became a kind of vampire and cannibal. And the guy told the story in the film with little action figures, kind of like the way Todd Haynes does in his Superstars movie about the Carpenters. And it was, it's an amazing story. And I just sitting there going like, wow, there is a point where human beings can get where they are just beyond the pale, where you cannot recover it. There's no connection between you and them, seemingly. And yet, the more you go into it, themes of cannibalism, themes of vampires, of this energy, it's completely pervading our popular culture. So there's some deep way in which we're tapped into this material, but how you look at it, how you talk about it, it's a really open and fascinating, dangerous, but intriguing and fruitful question. So we'll be talking about that this hour with Mikita Brottman. But first I'd like to bring on Expanding Mind's own psychopathologist. Masha, how you doing down there in L.A.?
I'm doing good. How are you, Erik?
Do you think of L.A. as a sort of particularly psychopathological place?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's interesting because a lot of L.A. and Hollywood culture has exactly to do with fascination. And I really like that you use that word because fascination actually comes from Latin, which means to bewitch or enchant, and it's literally like through a look. Like it's also affiliated with like the evil eye, and it means, like you were saying, how you rubberneck or look at an accident. It means literally like you can't take your eyes off of something, like your eyes are locked into something. And it's an enchantment that happens when your vision beholds something that you can't look away from. So it's like vampires. It's interesting you mentioned that, because they have this kind of tradition where they look at you and like you can't look away. Like it's a total like Medusa horror fascination thing. Like those things all kind of go together. And Hollywood makes these movies which, you know, you watch and you can't really look away from. You get bewitched or enchanted while you're watching the movie. So it's like, I mean, LA and Hollywood is all about fascination and bewitching people into looking at something that they can't really look away from.
That's great, because it reminds me of like when you go watch horror movies with people particularly who are, you know, say, oh, I don't really like horror movies, or maybe I'll check this one out. It's like the act of turning away from the screen is really significant for a lot of people. I mean, there are people I know who don't like violent imagery, and so we'll be watching not a horror movie, but just a regular movie, but some scene gets a little bit too over the top, and there's this conscious pulling your eyes away. Like there is this fundamental fascination we have with images, and it's funny how our language reflects it too. Like another word that people don't know the etymology of often is glamour, which was a less dark term than fascination. Glamour, we think of these wonderful stars and the world of fabulosity, but it too is an enchantment. It comes out of fairy lore, and
from fairy,
which
totally
would throw a glamour on somebody and capture them with this kind of fascination, and that's what's happening with rubbernecking. People just cannot look away. Everybody knows it's going to happen. The CHP knows it's going to happen. No one tries to stop it. It's just what it is.
Yep.
So let's bring on Mikita Brottman. Mikita is the chair of the Humanities Department at Pacifica University and the author of many books. And she is fascinated with precisely these topics. Mikita, welcome to Expanding Mind.
Thank you.
So tell me, where did your fascination with this stuff begin? I always like to start off with kind of more personal stories. When did you realize that you were a little bit more interested in the dark side of things than your run-of-the-mill human being?
I think it was when I was a kid, and your description. By the way, if you hear a noise in the background, it's my bulldog snoring. So just try and ignore it. When I was a kid, I was really fascinated by those late night horror films that were on TV. I was brought up in England, and my life was kind of rather bleak and dull and everyday working class family, not particularly interesting. And those every night there was usually a double bill of horror films. One of the sort of universal classics with Bela Lugosi or Lon Chaney, followed by a British, usually a Hammer film. And I got into the habit, this was like every weekend, of staying up late at night and watching those films, and there was this kind of real kind of interesting tension in me that I was absolutely drawn to this stuff because it was like nothing in my ordinary life. It was a world of darkness and quite glamorous and enchanting, but at the same time, it was terrifying. And I went through all those maneuvers that Erik was just talking about, putting my hand over my eyes, pulling myself back, peering through the fingers over my eyes, and I just became kind of addicted to that tension, that kind of fascinating tension, which I think, it was interesting, Erik, you talking about the road accidents and everything, because there's a kind of element to it which is turning over stones and finding out what's been going on all the time that we ordinarily repress in a civilized society. And so I think it started with horror films, but I think there's also something perhaps deeper going on, which is, when you're a kid, you sort of assume that, things are basically, the world is basically a decent place. Yes, you get teased. Yes, there are problems. Yes, you may not particularly get on with your brothers and sisters, but you assume the world is basically a decent place. But then gradually, as you get older, it's that kind of realizing one incident after another that, that this is not the place that you thought it was. this world is not the place you thought it was. There are terrible things going on, and sort of turning over one stone after another. I think I became fascinated by the desire to know what's really going on, what's going on behind those dark doors, what's going on, in secret places, what's really at stake here. And I think that's how it all began.
Well, it's interesting how, just by the way you're talking about it here, how much it has to do with a certain philosophical temperament, to not try to sound too pretentious, but a certain way of I think a lot of people sort of have this hunch that the ordinary, modern, secular human world that we live in, is just one side of the story or a surface. And people try to get beneath it in different ways through spiritual practice or through doing research on understanding, what's really going on in the economy or looking at quantum physics, what is this table really made up of, et cetera. But horror and the dark have a particular charge because, like, in my attitude is when I see that I'm kind of, there's an attitude of revulsion, like I get more interested. I'm like, oh, there must be something really interesting there because I'm already pulling away from it, whether it's like whatever, like I always think of like the fact that there are these tiny little microscopic parasites that are feasting on our dead skin every night. So every night you slide into bed and it's like, oh, it's so comfy, the day is over, I'm going to cuddle with my sweetheart, and there's these zillions of these things like nipping away at your, and you're like, I don't want to know about that. Yeah, I don't want to see that. And if you look at pictures of them, they're horrifying. You're like, God, they're all over the place. And yet, once you think about it, you're like, there's no reason to even bother with it. But there's that initial charge that's like, oh, right, this is kind of interesting. Let's follow the charge, Right, and I think for me that charge, the negative charge has always been much more appealing than the positive charge, and I've never been particularly interested in, glamour in the positive sense in terms of fashion or celebrities, except in the sense that this is a denial of our true humanity. And yet the negative charge, the repulsion, has always been fascinating to me. And I think when you're talking about road accidents, partly it's the notion that this is going on all the time. The parasites eating into our skin at night, or the car crashes are an inevitable side effect of our reliance on the automobile. That this is going on all the time, and yet it's necessary that we completely and constantly deny it. And that there's also a sense of, but for the grace of God to go at any moment, it's not me this time, thank God. So let me feast on the gratification and watch who it is and who it's happened to this time. But there's different ways of conceiving it. I mean, the family I grew up in was very, very left-wing. My mother was very involved in the Communist Party, and her opinion was that what we're repressing all the time is exploitation, and the working classes, the people who make conditions of existence possible, the people who clean up after us, the people who prepare our food, and it's important to sort of lift over the stones and look that in the face, look oppression and exploitation in the face. And I guess a Freudian way of looking at it too would be sexuality, that it's sexuality that is the charge behind everything, and that this pretty world that we live in is actually a sort of minefield of people competing for each other's sexual attention and so on. So that's another way of looking at it. But as I said, for me, these negative charges are far more appealing and interesting than positive charges, because they seem to bespeak a certain truth about the human condition that has just always. There's a German word, epistemophilia. Well, the English translation is epistemophilia, and I think that's something that I suffer from, like a desire to find out at all cost.
Well, it's really interesting that you say that, just because, like, all of these kind of phenomena, like you said, they are the hidden part. So it's like people are seeking out that is denied from them, that they don't see behind the scenes of who's making their food and who's hunting and killing the animals, like going to the slaughterhouse and things like that. And one thing I always think is very interesting is if you talk to the individuals who are involved with those behind the scenes, And, like, I'll talk to, for example, someone who's an EMT or works in an emergency room, or, you know, someone who works at a funeral home, or someone that is involved in those parts that are denied to other people. Their response to these things is not repulsion at all. You know, but that they have this kind of integration of that within themselves, so that they could watch, like, the gnarliest horror movies and just be like, yeah, whatever. Like, it doesn't evoke any kind of charge at all. Like, they don't really get a negative or a positive charge because it's become integrated into their personalities. So I think it's interesting that it can hold that much power and charge, like even like with sexual tension and things like that for so many people, but that if you just like look at it for what it is plainly and take it into yourself, that it loses that kind of power.
It does, and I agree with you, and that's a really interesting point, and I've talked to, you know, people who work in funeral homes and morticians and pathologists who say the same thing, but I also think, you know, it's fascinating to me that the pathologists I've talked to will also be, for example, seriously religious and go to church, or devoted family people, you know, and there are other aspects of that they'll kind of compartmentalize. So, yes, disgusting dead bodies don't affect them at all, but, you know, any insult to one of their children is horrifying. Right. So there are other areas of life that then become fetishized, I think. And I think I don't think this is a particularly radical thing to say, but as human beings, you know, in order to exist in this world, this civilization that we've developed, we have to repress. We have to have an area that we repress, and for most people it is, as I've been saying, the kind of dark pathological side of the human condition, but it could be anything.
Yeah.
Sometimes
like you look at some of the fetishes that are out there, and there's a pretty big range.
Exactly, yeah.
So I know since we've talked about car crash a few times, you edited a book about car crash culture. That's such a fascinating thing, because as soon as you say it, you're like, well, of course, it's such an important part of the modern imagination. You know, there have been these famous deaths in car crashes and J.G. Ballard's book, but we don't often think of it as like an actual thing. So just as a scholar, as someone who's interested in these things, you know, talk about how that project came about, or what was it about the car crash culture that attracted you?
You know, I was involved in a car crash myself, and I think that's what spurred my fascination. It was about 15 years ago, and I guess, you know, I'm sure a lot of people have had the same experience of being obviously injured and in shock. But I was kind of, even during the accident itself, looking at these sort of blood-covered people staggering around on a misty highway. I was sort of in a condition that I often find myself in, which is sort of looking on as an observer and fascinated by the scene. And of course, you know, adrenaline and endorphins and all kinds of things were obviously in play there. But I was fascinated by what's actually going on now and the state of mind I'm in. And even to the extent of sort of looking at myself in the car mirror and realizing that, you know, I was in the middle of a serious accident and all the implications of that and what it was going to lead to. And I've always been sort of interested in accidents as a byproduct of civilization, particularly American civilization. And there's an interesting essay by Octavio Paz, which I think I cite in that book, where he says that every invention comes with a new accident, the possibility of a new accident. And it's true, you know, automatic windows on cars, or automatic locking systems, or, you know, new innovations in elevators. Every time you have a new innovation, there's the repressed side of that is the possibility of a new and horrifying kind of accident. And just the American reliance on the automobile, which I really, you know, I came to live in the States about 11 or 12 years ago, and I'd heard about, but I'd never anticipated how important the car is to everyday life, and how everybody, you know, has a car, really, no matter almost what age or class. And the enormous cost of that were not just in terms of oil and gasoline, but the huge figures of traffic accidents that happen every month, which are, you know, far more people are killed on the road in traffic accidents every month than were killed in 9/11. But it's just something that goes without saying. You know, we rely on this mode of transportation, and this is part of contemporary civilization, and without it would be uncivilized. And so this is something that's just an epiphenomenon that we take for granted. And then I became fascinated by, I'm a sort of journal buff, and I like reading the pathology journals, and I found lots of interesting examples of people who had very strange kind of accidents, fetishized their cars, or been caught in sexually compromising positions in their cars, and the strange kind of accidents that can happen when you sort of delve into the annals of academic journals. And also the fascination with celebrity accidents too, because particularly with Princess Diana and Grace Kelly, there's a sense of sort of that it's much more important or much more appealing that it is the result of a conspiracy, that people who have everything cannot simply be a statistic. They cannot die the way that every Tom, Dick, and Harry dies. And so it's much more. It becomes very fascinating then for people to find out, well, why exactly did this happen, and what was really going on, and what was at stake. But the truth that that anyone can be the victim of a car accident is much more daunting.
Yeah, it almost has it's funny how it as ways of dying go. I mean, you must be fascinated with that too, the way that there's this relationship between how someone dies and to some extent when they die in their life and their life. It's like the way that we think about the meaning of someone's whole life is sort of conditioned in a backwards reflecting way by the circumstances of their death. So it's like you can't think about James Dean without thinking about that. You can't think even or Camus. It's like there's some relationship between these forms of death, and there's something particular about the car as well. What is it particular about the car that has that like strange flavor in a way as a way to go?
It's interesting with Camus too, because I believe that he couldn't drive, and that's the case with a number of people who we associate with a death in a car accident, and yet, like Jane Mansfield, for example, and yet they were a passenger, not a driver. And I think there's something about the people who I've talked to who are afraid to fly usually say that it's the lack of control, it's the lack of connection, that they're simply passive, that they're a victim, they're sitting in this container, this metal container that has absolutely nothing to do with them, and they can't control what happens. And I can see how intimidating that might be. But the truth is the most dangerous form of transportation is walking. You're far more likely to be killed as a pedestrian than you are as a driver, and certainly on an airplane, which is relatively safe. So I think what's fascinating about automobiles is that there's this illusion of control. There's this illusion that you're at the wheel, that it's all, it may be risky, but at least you have a chance of saving yourself. At least you have a chance of steering the vehicle out of the traffic. But in many cases, that's simply an illusion. But I think it's an understandable illusion and a necessary one. And also, I think the car is so deeply associated with progress and civilization and oil and America, and our fascination with the individual as well, with individuality. So a death on a bus or an airplane is not quite the same. It's your car, and your car goes on its own particular trajectory, and that has something to do with the trajectory of your life. And you're right, Eric, that we do tend to kind of take the person's death and then see that death as a kind of symbolic totem of their life in general, which is, kind of unfortunate. But it's true if you have friends or relatives who've died and you think of them, you tend to think of them as you knew them in the last stages of their life rather than as a youngster. And I think we tend to associate one's death with memory.
Well, it's funny, too, because, literally, you could use that as a metaphor for, how the cars are our vehicles, just like our bodies are the vehicles, and we think we have some kind of control of our bodies, which is totally not true. It's almost like as much control as we have of a vehicle, people think that they can steer it and go, but then they forget about every other factor existing in the world, like every other driver and all the other stuff. So it's this like isolated idea that you have control over like this isolated vehicle, which is apart somehow from the rest of the world. And it's funny how you talked about being a passenger. I don't drive. I live in L.A. and I don't have a driver's license. I never learned how to drive, and I walk, everywhere. And I'm always a passenger. Like I always, ride in the car and I hum the Iggy Pop passenger song to myself wherever I go. But it gives you this, for me, it's like the opposite of what you said, of being afraid of losing control. Part of doing that is for me to relinquish all control, and it's like this, almost like this practice of relinquishing control of everything and just learning to go with the flow. And being a passenger, you can do that very well, like because you're not really responsible for all that stuff, right? You can just kind of let it go. And with walking, I try to do that too. Like instead of becoming isolated from everything else, if you can become a part of everything by relinquishing that control, you can start to all of a sudden, when you're walking, you have to pay attention to everything else that's going on. Or you should. Like a lot of people, I guess, don't. But for me, what happens is I start connecting with everything that's happening all around me. So it's kind of an interesting idea.
Well, you must have a pretty zen attitude. I think for most people, the idea of being, especially if you're a driver yourself, being a passenger can be much more intimidating than being a driver. And I think I'm not a particularly good driver. I'm an even worse passenger because just, looking at a highway full of cars, in America, a 4 or 5 lane highway, cars going at enormous speeds, and every single one of those, all it would take is, a 30-degree turn of the wheel.
Totally.
To end in tragedy, and it's just a fascinating why it doesn't happen more often, I think.
It's kind of a miracle.
Well, we're reaching the half-hour here point, so I think we'll take a short break and be back. I want to switch the conversation a little bit and talk a little bit about psychotherapy and the occult, which is a topic I find fascinating, and I know you're interested in as well, Mikita. So you're listening to Expanding Mind here on the Progressive Radio Network, and we'll be right back after these messages.
You are listening to Progressive Radio Network.
This is Ellen Kamai, co-host of The Natural Nurse and Dr. Z. Dr. Eugene Zamperone and I have been deeply involved with indigenous cultures and combined traditional knowledge with the latest research in natural health care. Join us each week on PRN from 1 to 2 p.m. every Monday. We'll bring you authors, professors, researchers, and activists who are committed to bringing you the latest information which you can use to ensure maximum wellness for yourself, your cells, and your family. Tune in to Progressive Radio Network every Monday from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time or anytime by visiting the archives. This is Ellen Kamai, the Natural Nurse, hoping that you stay healthy.
Stephen Lindman hosts the Progressive Radio News Hour, Saturdays and Sundays, as well as currently on Thursdays, as an antidote to government and corporate propaganda on the most cutting-edge world and national topics. Distinguished guests are regularly featured to provide commentary and analysis impossible to the dominant media, offering biased, irresponsible misinformation and what Project Censored calls junk food news. The Progressive Radio News Hour airs Thursdays from 11 to 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, as well as Saturdays and Sundays at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Progressive Radio Network. Make it a regular habit and stay informed.
This is PRN, Progressive Radio Network.
All right, you're back with Expanding Mind. I'm host Erik Davis with Maja and our guest Mikita Brottman on the Progressive Radio Network. Just wanted to remind folks that now we have a nice podcast feed on the Progressive Radio Network website, so you can get us every week. Mikita, I know you teach at Pacifica University, which is a Jungian institute. I'm kind of curious how your work led you to a sort of psycho-spiritual, archetypal world of Jungian thought.
Well, my background is in literature, and I did a PhD in literature originally, and I taught literature in various universities. But the approach, my fascination with literature was always because it allowed me to escape from my quotidian everyday reality, which and which I saw as a kind of fascinating, the point of literature actually, rather than an epiphenomenon. And so I was always interested in the relationship between psychoanalysis and literature, just the sort of meta-language around literature, what books can do for you, where they lead you, what they, the psychological process of reading, how we get involved in books and our relationship with books, and then later on in my academic career, when I had a permanent job in the U.S., I then went in training in psychoanalysis, and I became very interested in. I see psychoanalysis as applied literature, as applying these ideas to people's lives, and Pacific is a place that allows me to sort of combine both strings in my quiver, both the literary and the psychoanalytic aspect. But my orientation has always been more Freudian than Jungian, and I'm very interested in Jung. I think Jung has some fascinating ideas, but I think Freud too is often dismissed today, both in mainstream psychology and in the spiritual world for various reasons. But I think the seeds of what Jung is doing in terms of merging spirituality with analytical psychology are all there in Freud, but for various reasons he didn't follow through. He went in different directions, partly because it was very important to Freud at the time to disentangle psychoanalysis from the realm of the spiritual, because I think he was afraid that if people started to associate psychoanalysis with the occult and with the supernatural, its reputation would be seriously endangered, that he had to make psychoanalysis part of the field of medicine and of science. And of course, eventually it was totally absorbed by psychiatry. But I think there are Freud has done some really interesting work on the occult, on prophetic dreams, on thought transference that gets very little attention nowadays. But in many ways, he was really ahead of his time.
Well, that's a really interesting thing. I mean, the more I studied the roots of psychology in the mid and late 19th century, you just find all of these overlaps with what we would now think of as occult or spiritual activities. I mean, even the whole idea of automatic writing,
right,
which comes to serve as a vehicle or a route into the unconscious, was of course
right,
originally explored in a sort of spiritualist context, where the idea explicitly was what the spirits were writing through one, and there was a number of these kind of spiritualist techniques or practices which overlap, to say nothing of hypnotism itself. And
right,
hypnotism seems to be, in some ways, the great repressed of psychoanalysis, where obviously the psychoanalytic session kind of emerges out of explorations into hypnotism, and anybody who looks at hypnotism for very long is going to find at least the appearance of apparently spiritual or occult phenomena of clairvoyance and clairaudience and thought transference, and very hard-headed scientists will who go into that realm will go, well, you got to look at this stuff. It seems to happen. They might not believe that it says anything about the occult structure of the world, but there's all of this really incredibly juicy stuff. But when you talk to people now about psychoanalysis, like that whole side of it is just really obscured.
Yeah, and there are various reasons for that. Partly the way that psychoanalysis has become sort of institutionalized, or that it's constantly been under threat, and that it's in many ways been absorbed into various other kinds of psychotherapies, and in fact, psychoanalysis as Freud developed it is really not done anymore. But you're right that spiritualism and psychoanalysis developed at the same time and really in the same place in Europe in the late 18th, early 19th century. And Freud was clearly, he worked with Charcot, who was influenced by Mesmer, and there are all these associations between hypnotism, mesmerism, and psychoanalysis, mostly in this fascination with the subliminal self or the unconscious, which most, if you study psychology in a university today, you look at Freud in a way that a chemist will look at alchemy, that this is a bizarre theory that people used to believe, and yes, historically it's fascinating, but it really has no relevance to the way things are done today, and yet the forces, those unconscious forces like transference and projection and repression and sublimation that came to play and had an effect in things like somnambulism and catalepsy and hysteria and magnetism, are all a really fundamentally integral to psychoanalysis, and also to various therapies that are insurance reimbursable today. But people don't. You're right. People don't really like to look into the connection between, well, what is this thing called transference? What is this thing called projection? How do these invisible forces work? What's actually going on in this room between these two people that allows one to have a very powerful influence over the other, so that the other's life is changed and affected by it? It's pretty interesting, because that is literally the heart of fascination. I mean, when you're dealing with mesmerism and hypnotism, it's, like looking into someone's eyes and putting them under the hypnotic stare, But at the root of it, it is about the mechanism behind influence and how we can be held, how our attention and consciousness can be held and influenced by something. That is literally the definition of fascination, that it is something which is holding our influence irrevocably, that we cannot look away from. And that is, all the Mesmer works, like that he wrote about on animal magnetism, had to do with his obsessive search for that mechanism behind the influence. And he went from thinking it was him personally. He did his PhD thesis on thinking it was the stars and the heavens, and he did all this stuff on astrology that he kind of ripped off from this other fellow. But anyway, but yeah, and that directly went into hypnotism. The guy that sort of invented hypnotism, James Braid, studied with Mesmer, and then it's funny, like you said, that became this kind of part of psychotherapy that they ignored all those occultish parts. Oh, and Mesmer also got a lot of his stuff from Paracelsus, who was an alchemist. So right. It was all totally related to occult and alchemy, and then it just kind of gets put into medical clinical terms, and they.
Well, here's a question from that for Mikita, because you can look at now you can look back at Freud and at Jung, and you can see the way that in some ways they were transforming this much older tradition of exploring the outer reaches of human psychology, the human mind, through these various practices and techniques, which take the form of mesmerism or even spiritualism. And then they were obviously changing them and refining it and recontextualizing some of those explorations. But as you said, Freud was looking at occult phenomena, and certainly Jung is overlapping all sorts of spiritual stuff. But from our perspective today, with SSRIs and the rise of cognitive science and cognitive behavior techniques, as you say, a lot of people studying psychology today, nearly all people studying psychology today would look at Freud and Jung, as let alone the earlier guys, as being essentially kind of fairy tales. Now, do you think the really important stuff there is actually continuing on, it's just changing its shape once again, or are we really looking at a rupture where fundamentally different models of mind are starting to influence and be practiced in terms of psychology that really represent a break from this juicier, literary, and ultimately somewhat kind of occult line of approaching psychology?
I think there's a real break, a real rupture, and the juicy stuff, as you say, no longer finds a place. There is a field called neuropsychoanalysis, where Freud's the theory being that Freud didn't have obviously neural imaging techniques, but and he said very clearly that that he didn't have the equipment, or that science wasn't advanced enough to study the brain in the ways that it would in the future, and that's why he used techniques like free association. And that neuropsychoanalysts, the chief among them is a man named Mark Solms, believes that the neurology of the brain actually reflects, Freud's original idea of the ego and the id. But that's a very, very small branch of what's going on in neuroscience today. And I think there's a real division, a real split, because and the split came when psychoanalysis became absorbed into psychiatry and partook of the material, empirical realm, when things had to be replicated in experimental situations. Because, the point of Freudian psychoanalysis is that you're dealing with the individual, and what happens in the consulting room between analyst and analysand is irreducible and irreplicable. It happens once and once only, and it can't be reproduced, and it's totally subjective, and in some ways it has nothing to do with empirical science as we know it today. And there was also a division, I think, in when mediumship and parapsychology, when parapsychologists, I'm kind of fascinated by the early history of parapsychology and mediums like D.D. Home, who were convinced, as the observers were convinced too, that they were dealing with a phenomenon that was coming from outside of the mind, that was coming from another world, or the spirits of the dead. And when people began thinking of mediumship and thought transference and so on as being completely internal, self-produced, nothing to do with the outside of the individual themselves, I think that's when the split really occurred. That the mind was not open to outside influence. That whatever phenomenon was produced, automatic writing or schizophrenic voices, were coming from the unconscious or another part of the mind itself. And once you take external forces out of it, I think you lose a lot of the juicy, spooky, creepiness that is so fascinating to me.
But today you lose even more, because even if you have this idea that it all comes from inside the mind, that there's still this draw to kind of unpack, like with think about dream work, that there's that even in a modern psychoanalytic setting, you have some terrible dream of monsters and vampires and your mother and whatever, and it's like, okay, we're going to go in there, we're going to read it, like you say, like a literary text, we're going to dive into these symbols and see if there's some meaning. But even that gets sort of left aside largely, it seems to me, with these new cognitivist approaches, which are based more on behavior, like, well, are you functioning in your life? Are you
right.
Are you overwhelmed? Are you depressed? Okay, well, here are some strategies. Well, yes, you had this dream, fascinating, but really there's nothing to be gained by looking for meaning. It's more like you're a machine that we got to try to, tweak the knobs and dials. How do you feel about this sort of new cognitive development? Do you think it's inevitable? Is it a terrible shame? What ways are the repressed going to return now if we kind of chase them out of our psychological understanding and we no longer have an id that we refer to? We no longer think about dreams as a golden road into the unconscious. How's that going to affect how people feel?
Well, it's interesting, because in some ways I'm really fascinated by the work of Adam Phillips, who's a literary scholar and also a psychoanalyst, and his theory is that in a period when psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis, is being wholeheartedly embraced, that is a big problem. That's beside the point, because part of psychoanalysis involves resistance, and that in a period like ours where there's enormous resistance, there's so much resistance to psychoanalysis that, like you said, it's not even taught. It's certainly nothing to do with medicine or psychology. That's a very, Philip said, that's a very fruitful time for the unconscious to manifest itself. And so in some ways, this kind of denial of the unconscious, this, apart from in kind of Pavlovian mechanisms, very mechanistic kind of clinical version of the unconscious. But the idea that the unconscious has no meaning is almost inciting it to manifest itself in other ways. So so I am kind of fascinated where this will lead. And also I think that in some ways the Freudian Jungian kind of belief in and fascination with the unconscious has manifested itself in other areas like transpersonal psychology, for example, particularly here in California, where and the sort of New Age spiritual recrudescence, and there's plenty of opportunity for studying areas beyond rational ego functioning, like conscious studies and near-death experience and spiritual inquiry and body-mind relationships. But outside of science and psychology, the kind of workshops that go on at SLN, or the kinds of transpersonal mystical experiences to do with near-death experiences. I mean, but all of that New Age psychology is being embraced with open arms. So I think in some ways that's where it's gone.
Interesting. But do you feel that in that domain, my guess would be that in that domain, one of the things that we lose inside the sort of New Age, psychospiritual, transpersonal, self-help zone, which has kind of carried on a lot of these practices and an openness to the outside world or an openness to other dimensions, whether it's inside the self or outside the self, but it tends to not highlight that pathological dimension, that kind of kernel of what we're really resisting, or what our real fears are, or our disgust, or our revulsion, or our fascination. That the shadow side. I mean, in Jungian work, you hear a lot about the shadow. Yeah. I mean, that was my impression. I don't know the Jungian world that well. My impression is that you hear a lot about the shadow and about integrating the shadow, and everyone acknowledges the shadow and stuff, but it doesn't actually ever really feel like I'm in the zone of the shadow when I'm around that material. Whereas the car culture, serial killers, the foul dimensions of sexuality, like those kinds of things where it's like we really encounter them. And I think that if people are being honest with themselves, they recognize inside themselves they have these conflicted feelings or attractions or whatever. That I don't really see appearing too often. I don't know, maybe it was more that way in the wild 70s, but it has to,
the problem is it has to be commodified and sold. And so, Freud's original idea that he can convert hysterical misery to everyday unhappiness, nobody's going to, say that in your ad, nobody's going to come and see you. I was really interested in your interview with Erik Wilson, was that his name? The guy who was talking about happiness, and that was really fascinating because, to me, really getting in touch with the self and the shadow of the self does not involve leading a happier life, leading a more pleasant life, even being cured in any practical respect. That there is a real darkness there that is not open to commodification, and that your insurance company is not going to pay out for you to have ordinary unhappiness. It's just it doesn't fit into this sort of I was going to the American, but it's more like a Western mindset that you go to therapy to help you feel better, not to help you feel actually more in touch with yourself, which might actually lead to you feeling worse and more in touch with yourself. And you're certainly right about the shadow. I think most people come to Jung through sort of Joseph Campbell and that kind of follow your bliss version of Jungianism is quite away from what Jung himself suggested, which is, and it's very radical, I think, not just that you acknowledge your shadow side, but that the shadow, it in some ways is the better side of you, and that it's not just a question of, like, say you realize that you have a certain aggressive tendencies. It's not just a question of incorporating those tendencies into your everyday personality and accepting them, but acknowledging that might be your true nature. That might actually be more genuine to yourself than your sort of polite, decorous, everyday self. And you're right. It's that kind of. I mean, there's a lot of talk now about the Red Book, and Jung has been really acclaimed for his bravery and in exploring the dark side of the self and so on. But I don't see anyone else incorporating that total disinhibition of boundaries into their work. I mean, it's okay.
Well, it's very interesting to me that you bring that up, because I think it's true. And Jung has always said that he was glad he was a Jung and not a Jungian. Because,
right.
He was dealing with a lot of that stuff, but you don't necessarily see it in the Jungian stuff. And I think that's a really good place for you to mention that you do this, that it's kind of something about being honest with yourself and getting in touch with yourself about the shadow side. And that I just wanted to bring up that you wrote a book called The Solitary Vice. Mm-hmm. Against reading, and one of the things that I really liked that you kind of compared it to is that that word comes from the Victorian way of describing masturbation, and that it is a private thing, and in masturbation, kind of like compulsive reading, that you go into this kind of fantasy world. And I think for a lot of people, one of the places where they are really honest with themselves is in masturbation, especially with fetishes or fantasies or fascinations, right? All those things that you're fascinated with, you may only be honest with yourself in those dark recesses of your bedroom, and then never talk about it to anyone else, like you said, like when you have your kind of nice little life or whatever. But one of the things that I thought was so interesting, which goes along with what we're saying with the kind of split between Jung and Freud, where it becomes the individual against the collective, where something is private and dealt with in a solitary way and in the darkness and in the recesses, is that there is something ultimately completely connective with these isolated, solitary fascinations, that even though we're not, talking about them and we're doing it in private and we're not really sharing it with anything else, ultimately that act of having our fascination and our fantasy and our deepest shadows are things that are involved with, many other people. Like even when you're masturbating, you're usually not thinking about yourself. I mean, I don't know, maybe some totally narcissistic people might be having that issue, but you're thinking about something else. And even, when you're reading a book, you're privately connecting to some other consciousness on a very intimate level. So even through that kind of shadow, solitary, isolationist activity, it is ultimately connecting you with this collective unconscious. And that, I think, is a big part of the Red Book and everything.
Yeah, and I think, I write in that book about I'm really fascinated by, and sort of addicted to reading psychological case studies, and one of the things that I find so fascinating reading about, the most bizarre and florid, frightening things that people do, that Erik was talking about Richard Chase before, that the more you read these case studies and the more you find out about the human mind, the more you realize that that's one end of a continuum that we're all on. And I think I'm not alone in this, that I'm engaged by things that are not recognizable, and yet they're not recognizable because they're so familiar in a way. And that's Freud's definition of the uncanny, that he says that that things that are so close to us that we cannot recognize them because we see them in an unfamiliar form. So Richard Chase, the Chicago cannibal, drinking viscera from his blender, is actually the extreme of the continuum of the child drinking from the breast. And that's what Freud says. That's what the uncanny is. It's encountering ourselves as children, but encountering our childhood memories in a form that are so alienating that we no longer recognize them. And yet there's a little charge that reminds us that actually, in that horrible, frightening scenario, that is me. And that just, that's really compelling, I think.
Well, here's a question that comes from all this when we're talking about how does one get to that place where you are genuinely interested or willing to go into the dark and to look at the consequences for the self and to confront death or your own death or your own tendencies in this direction. And I keep coming back to these terms that are almost like out of fashion now, like authenticity. Like if you're going to be living an authentic life, then you're going to be a life where you're not going to turn away from all of these dimensions. Whereas we've sort of, in the postmodern world has sort of undermined that as a legitimate category. You can't really use that as an academic or a philosopher unless you're kind of a weirdo. We're all kind of see that it's sort of a construct and it has these problems. So instead, when people are looking for fundamental values of what organizes their behavior, whereas once there might have been, well, to be authentic even in the face of horror or my own undermining of my own belief that I'm a good person or a human person, whatever. Instead, it's like, well, it's all just open-ended, so why wouldn't I just program myself to maximize pleasure and happiness? Because those are obviously short-term goods, and maybe there are no long-term goods, so why not just go for it? And so I'm curious for you, do you feel that beyond your intellectual interest, beyond your taste or your aesthetic or whatever, that you've found that there is a kind of gift in pursuing these darker, more disturbing questions about yourself and about the world and about human psychology? And what is that? What is that deeper gift?
Well, it's a difficult question. It's a great question. It's a very difficult question to answer because one normally associates a gift with something that's going to give positive results and that's going to be a pleasure to open and be rewarded by. And I think the first thing you have to do is kind of toss all those value judgments aside and say that it may be a question of lifting the veil rather than receiving a gift, and seeing the things that our culture and society by necessity hides from us, and lifting that veil and kind of facing the darkness head on, and not flinching from it. But in doing that is a realization and a recognition that it's not going to give any particular personal benefit to one's life. It's going to make it very difficult. For example, if someone actually faces the fact of their own death, it's then going to make it very difficult to live a day-to-day life, to have kids, to get married, to invest in the system of human activity. So the outcome of it may not be what we associate with positive, healthy living. But I can only speak personally, and to me, there's a deeper truth, which is understanding what it means to be a human being living in a human body, and not and refusing to deny any of that, anything that comes with it. And it's not going to. The point is, it's not going to make one happy.
Right. Well, I think it's that there's deeper rewards than happiness. It's sort of like what we were talking about with Erik Wilson. So we only have a minute left. If people are interested in your work, Mikita, and want to check it out, do you have any essays online or any place that people can go to find out more about what you're up to?
I have a website. It's just my name, MikitaBrottman.com, and I have essays on there, and there's a link to where people can buy my books from Amazon and some interviews and that kind of thing. It's just my name, MikitaBrottman.com.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And folks, remember now we have the podcast feed on Expanding Minds. You can get it nice and easy every week. Next week we're going to talk to John Law, one of the co-founders of Burning Man, a completely fascinating character who has explored many dimensions of life. That'll be a real treat. I'm happy to have gotten him. And so thanks to Maja. Thanks to Mikita. Any last words, Maja?
Thanks, guys. That was awesome.
Okay. Thanks, Mikita.
Thank you.